Waiting room, so oh, I can get started here. Give me one moment. All right. All right. So hi everyone. Thank you for attending this presentation today from the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. The presentation is part of NASCA's speaker series, Climate Talks for Everyone. Our Climate Talks for Everyone are designed to provide you with everything you ever wanted to know about climate change, encompassing the science behind climate change, its impact on the planet, people, and nature, and what you can do to help. You can RSVP for upcoming presentations and watch recordings of previous presentations at nasca.org. And then, here we go. The presentation today is titled Gender and Climate Change, How Women Are Leading Us to a More Sustainable Future. Our presenter is Dr. Frances Reamer. Frances Julia Reamer, a professor in educational foundations at Northern Arizona University, focuses on climate issues through a social justice lens. She co-founded the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance and is involved in developing, writing, and adopting municipal climate action plans. Dr. Reamer speaks on gender and climate change and grassroots action around climate. She hosts the podcast Climate Conversations, Stories from Our Backyards. Dr. Reamer's current research investigates intersectional understandings of climate action, decolonial feminisms and tourism, and universities as women-serving institutions. She is editor of Front and Backstage of Tourism Performance, Imaginaries and Bucket List Venues, author of Working at the Margins, Moving Off Welfare in America, and co-editor of Qualitative Research and Introduction to Methods and Designs. So without further ado, Dr. Frances Reamer.
Jordan, thank you so much. I really appreciate your facilitating this session, and thank you all my very good friends for joining us today. And Frank, thanks for zooming in from South Africa. I couldn't be more happy that you're with us. So let's begin. So yesterday, I was reading the New York Times and I saw this article about Texas. Texas fire tops 1 million acres, a grim record, 1 million acres. So apparently, wildfires are nothing new for ranchers, many of who know how to transform their pickups into makeshift fire trucks. But never before has anyone seen a fire quite like this. And of course, the fire is so much larger because of the effects of climate change, right? Climate change is likely making fire seasons start earlier and last longer by increasing the number of days in a year with hot and dry weather conditions that enable wildfires. So, and we know we're seeing this in our area. We are vulnerable to wildfires and floods. We know that looks different depending on where you are. We know that the effects of climate and climate change are different depending on where you live in the world, but we know that we are all in the middle of this. We are experiencing, right? So I'm going to share my screen here as I talk. If I can remember how to do it. So let's see here. Share screen. So when I started thinking about, here it goes. Okay, thanks. So when I first began thinking about climate change and gender, I wasn't sure what I would find, but these are both issues that are around which I've spent a considerable amount of time. I'm a feminist anthropologist, and so when I think about learning and teaching, or when I think about tourism, or when I think about climate change, I think about how does gender, how is this issue shaped by, and how does it shape gender and gender relations? I also take my role as steward seriously around climate change in Sedona, in my hometown, and with the earth writ large. And I recognize the frightening urgency of the climate crisis and the dire need for action. Just talked about the Texas wildfires. So after saying all that, what I found when I started to dig was that climate change and gender go hand in hand, and that addressing climate change is addressing gender equity. I'll explain what we mean by that in this talk today. I want to start by a quote from Logan Dreher. Quote, Climate change, like other disasters, maps onto existing inequalities in our society. A trans woman afraid to sleep in a hurricane evacuation center is living at the intersection of the climate crisis and patriarchy. Indigenous women whose breast milk is poisoned by pollution also live in this place. No person lives a single issue life. As environmental feminists have demonstrated again and again, climate justice and gender justice are the same struggle, and we must treat them as such. And as the poet and much beloved feminist Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. So to illustrate these connections, I'll lay out three themes. I want to talk about intersectionality and climate justice, and then the risks and burdens on women posed by climate change, and then relatedly, the critical roles that women play to address climate change. Now, I want to say right away that the goal is to be as inclusive and intersectional as possible in using the term women. So recognizing that we've had a history of essentializing what we mean by women, who counts and who doesn't, we're going to cast a broader net here. So I also define women to include not only what we call cis women, but trans women, feminine identifying, gender queer, and non-binary folks as well. So by better understanding how gender may affect climate change vulnerability and resilience, it helps communities and collaborating agencies and organizations better embark on climate change initiatives that alleviate rather than exacerbate intersectional oppression. So just a brief note about what I mean by intersectionality, since I've used that term a couple times. So the notion of intersectionality comes from a legal social scientist, Kimberly Crenshaw, developed from her own frustration around court cases involving women of color. And Kimberly Crenshaw observed the ways in which the legal system seemed to handle race and sex discrimination claims. And she saw that over and over again, Black women consistently had their discrimination claims denied. And these reflections caused Crenshaw to develop this framework that we're now calling intersectionality, a framework to trace the impact of racism, of sexism, other modes of discrimination, where they come together and create sometimes unique circumstances, obstacles, barriers for people who are subject to all of these things. Right? So we're really thinking about the effects of climate change exponentially, depending on where you find yourself in society. So climate justice, then, as we know, is the way that intersectionally gets operationalized by climate change movements. It's how we think about equity and climate change at the same time. So women with disabilities, Indigenous women, women of color, young women, trans women, rural women, gender nonconforming youth. Climate change affects everyone, but some bear the brunt of it. So we know that climate change has a greater impact on these sections of the population in all countries that are most vulnerable, those that are reliant on natural resources for their livelihoods, and who have the least capacity to respond to natural hazards like droughts, landscapes, floods, hurricanes. We know that socioeconomic status, class, right, affects social vulnerability in terms of people's access to the marketplace, capital and property ownership, and the ability to cope with structural changes within economies. So an intersectional analysis of climate change reveals that gender role expectations and existing gender inequality can affect a person's vulnerability, resilience, and adaptive capacity. We know that gender roles aren't static. They vary across time and place, that they're relational, and they're constantly renegotiated. So we're not talking about all young women, all trans women, all whatever. But despite this constant flux, many societies have had long-standing gender-based power inequalities. And In fact, as climate change progresses, pre-existing gender inequality will worsen. Not only women are affected by gender, not only women are affected by gender inequality, but transgender and other gender non-conforming individuals are often misunderstood and discriminated in various societies. So to quote Katrin Jakobsen, the Prime Minister of not Ireland, but should be Iceland, every time I see this slide, I note Ireland and then I completely forget about it after the talk. So human rights, social justice, and gender inequality are all intrinsically connected. Because climate change affects the poor more than the rich, the underprivileged more than the privileged, and women differently than men. And she continues, we have called for the integration of gender concerns in global environmental policies, including the workings of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Women's roles as primary caregivers and providers of food and fuel render them more vulnerable to flooding and drought and other consequences of climate change. So to illustrate what that looks like, the literature cuts this conversation in 5 different ways. So keep in mind that many of the examples here are from the global South, but we can think about what the implications are for those of us who find ourselves in the global North as well. So first, poverty. While statistics are in play and they're different in different sources, we know that across the globe, women and girls living in poverty, in particular, face higher risks and greater burdens from the impact of climate. Women and girls are often the last to eat or be rescued. They face greater health and safety risks as water and sanitation systems become compromised, and they take on increased domestic and care work. The World Health Organization describes the link between women's roles as caretakers, poverty and health, as women and girls are generally expected to care for the sick, including in times of disaster and environmental stress. This limits the time they have available for income generation and education, which, when coupled with rising medical costs associated with family illness, heightens levels of poverty, which is in turn a powerful determinant of health. So in short, the socioeconomic conditions of women make them particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. This is even more so, this is even true for individuals for whom gender and race intersect, doubly challenging their ability to find employment. As Prinderville states, women of color who bear the double burden of gender and racial discrimination are often economically and politically marginalized. And given employment discrimination for transgender individuals, retaining a job or seeking new employment can be particularly challenging when climate disasters force movement and change. Although little research has been conducted specifically on the health conditions of LGBTQ+ individuals, literature reveals that members of the community struggle to find healthcare experts and options that meet their unique needs, making them likely to postpone care or receive inadequate care, and thus it again increases their vulnerability. So next, researchers talk about food security. So that depending on the region, women farmers account for 45 to 80% of all food production in what we call developing countries. About 2/3 of the female labor force in the global South, and more than 90% in many African countries, are engaged in agricultural work. In the context of climate change, traditional food sources become more unpredictable and scarce. Women face loss of income as well as harvest, often their sole source of income and food. Related increases in food prices make food more inaccessible to poor people, in particular to women and girls, whose health is found to decline more than male health in times of food shortages. So third, we have deforestation. So according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, by the end of the century, the climate change is likely to be the major contributor to biodiversity loss. Biodiversity plays an important role in climate change adaptation and mitigation. An estimated 1 in 6 persons globally relies on food, including about 60 million indigenous people who are almost wholly dependent on forests. Forests also provide green manure, fodder for animals, and various other inputs for smallholder agriculture. It's important to note that the declining biodiversity not only impacts material welfare and the livelihoods of people, it also cripples access to security, resilience, social relations, health, and freedom of choices and action. So in places like Indonesia, Brazil, and other parts of the world, deforestation has meant that wood, the most widely used fuel, is located further away from the places that folks live. In many countries in the global south, women and girls are responsible for collecting traditional fuels, a draining task that can take from 2 to 20 hours per week. And Frank knows what I'm talking about here. As a result, women have less time for domestic responsibilities, to earn money, or engage in politics or other public activities, to learn to read or acquire other skills, or simply to rest. Girls are sometimes kept home from school to help gather fuel, perpetuating a cycle of disempowerment. When environmental degradation forces them to search further for resources, women and girls become more vulnerable to injuries from carrying heavy loads, longer distances, and according to the women with whom I work in Botswana, they face increased risk of sexual harassment and assault. So fourth is water. So climate change also affects sources for fresh water and the availability of water for domestic and productive tasks. In many countries, we know women and girls are responsible for fetching water for their families, and they can spend significant amount of time hauling water every day. The water from distant sources is not only rarely enough to meet the needs of the household, but it's often contaminated. Women and girls again pay the heaviest price for poor water-based sanitation. So an example that's often given is around groundwater, which has been contaminated by arsenic in the Ganga River basin in India, which encompasses significant geographic portions of the river basin, encompasses significant geographic portions of India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Tibet. So increased flood levels intensify the rate of exposure among rural people and other socioeconomic disadvantaged groups. The resulting health problems can include lesions, skin hardening, dark spots, swollen limbs, the loss of feeling. And we can sort of cycle this out to think about the effects of young girls who are trying to engage in community. And what happens is that women tend to get shunned, excluded, or stigmatized because of the effects of these arsenic-related illnesses. The stigma impacts the ability of single women to get married, and unmarried women are more vulnerable to poverty and social exclusion. And so we see how these impacts get unfolded across these various connections in our lives. And lastly, climate. While climate defines the geographic distribution of infectious diseases, weather influences the timing and the severity of epidemics. For example, and we know this here in northern Arizona, diseases transmitted by mosquitoes are particularly sensitive to variations in climate. And we have seen in northern Arizona an increase in our own mosquito population over the course of the last 20 years. Warmth accelerates the biting rate of mosquitoes and speeds up the maturation process of the parasites they carry. Sub-Saharan Africa is already home to the most efficient mosquito species and to the most severe forms of malaria. So rising temperatures are likely to accelerate the life cycle of the malaria parasite and to spread malaria to new areas. Floods that are increasingly concomitant with climate change may also increase the prevalence of water-related diseases, especially water and vector-borne diseases, which affect millions of people every year. An increase in diseases aggravates women's caregiving of family and community members who may also be ill from these diseases. So what I find particularly striking is that gender equality plays an important role here. So we know that at the most basic, mortality rates for women and men are often different in natural disasters because of social, political, and economic advantages that favor men at the expense of women. Women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die during a disaster. 14 times. Women accounted for 61% of fatalities caused by Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008, 70 to 80% in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and 91% in the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh. A recent study, a 2006 study of 100 equal to men, more women than men die in disasters. This gender discrepancy has come to light in a range of major disasters, including the tsunamis that I just mentioned, Hurricane Mitch, Hurricane Katrina, other storms in the Americas, European heat waves, and cyclones in South Asia. The vulnerability of women to climate-related disasters is increased, as we already said, for a number of reasons. And we know that poor women and those in countries with higher gender equality then appear to be at the highest risk. A direct correlation has been observed between women's status in society and their likelihood of receiving adequate health benefits in times of disaster and environmental stress. So another area of investigation has been around gender violence and climate change. To quote the largest and most comprehensive study on gender and climate change conducted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, took over 2 years and involved more than 1,000 sources of research on gender-based violence and climate change. Quote, we found gender-based violence to be pervasive, and there is enough clear evidence to suggest that climate change is increasing gender-based violence, said Kate Owen, a lead author of the study. The study shows that the damage humanity is inflicting on nature is also fueling violence against women around the world, a link that has largely been overlooked. Indigenous women and LGBTQ plus people in the US are vulnerable because their race and gender intersect to create socioeconomic and environmental challenges that affect their climate change resilience. For example, Indigenous women experience one of the highest rates of violence of any women in the US, making them particularly vulnerable to escalating rates of domestic and sexual violence that have been documented after natural disasters or weather-related crises. Global heating puts pressure on resources as extreme weather, including heat waves, droughts, floods, and fiercer storms, grow more frequent and devastating. In most parts of the world, women are already disadvantaged and lack land rights and legal rights, so they're vulnerable to exploitation. When the additional stresses caused by climate crisis occur, girls are the first to be targeted. For instance, in some communities, young girls are married off as early as possible when the family faces hardships exacerbated by the climate. Globally, about 12 million more young girls, 12 million more young girls are thought to have been married off after increasing natural disasters. The report that I had mentioned, the IUCN report, is based on quotes, one by a young girl, Natoya Sande, who was 13 and in Malawi when she got married against her will. She said to the researchers, I was sent to be married because of a shortage of food in the house. Her parents used to have a small piece of land, but floods wiped out their harvest. She continued, I tried to negotiate to tell my parents that I wasn't ready, that I didn't want to get married, but they told me that I had to because that would mean one less mouth at the table. So weather-related disasters have been shown to increase sexual trafficking by 20 to 30%. And human trafficking continues to rise in areas where the natural environment is under stress. So we also see links between gender-based violence and environmental crimes like illegal resource extraction. The IUCN researchers documented close links between gender-based violence, the exploitation of women and girls, and the competition for resources engendered by the impacts of global heating and our destruction of the natural environment. Sexual abuse is found to be rampant in the illegal fishing industry in Southeast Asia. In Eastern and Southern Africa, fishermen reportedly refused to sell fish to women if they didn't engage in sex. The illegal logging and charcoal trade in the Democratic Republic of Congo is linked closely to sexual exploitation. And in Colombia and Peru, illegal mining is strongly associated with an increase in sex trafficking. Relationships have also been found among environmental degradation, climate change, terrorism, and gender-based violence. And this is changing environmental conditions in the Lake Chad Basin of northeastern Nigeria, for example, have been found to have aided the recruitment and operations of Boko Haram in Nigeria, the jihadist terrorist organization that, if you remember, in 2014 abducted 276 schoolgirls, and in 2018 kidnapped another 100 schoolgirls. There's a photo of the schoolgirls who were kidnapped. Right. And so we see this environmental degradation and terror and the attraction to terrorist organizations, and then the exploitation and violence against women, all being part of a chain. There have also been numerous examples of gender-based violence directed against environmental defenders and activists who try to stop the destruction or the degradation of their land, natural resources, and communities. Sexual violence is used to suppress them, undermine their status within the community, and discourage others from coming forward. In 2016, Honduras rights activist Berta Cáceres was shot and killed inside her house after leading a movement against a dam project. And so enough time has passed since Hurricane Katrina to provide data for studies in what are the effects of climate change. And of course, we know Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in the southern US. This study was done by the Women's Policy Research. At the time that Hurricane Katrina hit, 25.9% of women in New Orleans were living below the poverty level, compared to 20% of men. So, and we know that poverty matters because it limits resources that in turn allow more opportunities for escape or for survival when escape is impossible. The Women's Policy Research organization interviewed women who were residents of New Orleans public housing at the time of Katrina. Few of them had cars, so under normal circumstances, they were able to get around the city by walking or by bus or trolley. But when the city flooded after the levees broke, the women who could escape their homes were stranded around the city unless they were able to find someone with an undamaged vehicle who would help. Other factors also worsened the situation for them. Women shared greater responsibility for childcare and more often worked at home in residences of less stable construction than commercial or public buildings. Women who were pregnant or recovering from childbirth had limited mobility and faced additional difficulties. Women also made up a greater proportion of the elderly, typically one of the groups with the highest mortality rates during disasters, especially when, as in the case of New Orleans, hospitals were not evacuated. Women also a higher risk of gender-based violence at the time and during the immediate response and years that followed. The rate of gender-based violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence in Mississippi, rose from 4.6 per 100,000 per day when Katrina hit to 16.3 per 100,000 per day. So that means that the rates rose 4 times after Katrina. In addition, the number of households headed by low-income single families in New Orleans dropped from 18,000 to 3,000, including a significant displacement of these women and their children. In the meantime, transgender people globally often report discrimination in natural disaster responses. In one high-profile case from after Katrina, a trans woman was locked in jail for days after she used the showers for women in a Texas shelter. In the aftermath, when cities and homes have to be rebuilt, women, trans, and non-binary people also face the steepest climb to recovery, as they're more likely to already be in poverty. So, what do we do? What about policy? So the relevance of gender in the context of climate change is now being acknowledged in the international arena. Yet for far, far too long, climate change policies or initiatives have not addressed gender impacts and solutions. The 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change didn't mention any gender or social issues. In 2012, gender and climate became a standing item on the annual Conference of the Parties, the governing body of the international climate negotiations process. The preamble of the 2016 Paris Agreement called upon all countries to respect, promote, and consider, among others, human rights, gender equality, and empowerment of women when taking action to address climate change. So while this introduction was not binding, it nevertheless played a role in the interpretation of the agreement and provided a strong entry point for gender responsive national policies. But during the climate talks for the Paris Agreement, only 1 in 3 delegates was a woman, as well as 1 in 10 heads of state. Women and gender advocacy groups began to raise awareness on gender in the years after the 2017, so 5+ years ago, at the COP23 in Bonn, Germany. Its aim is to serve as a kind of roadmap to ensure that gender equality is integrated in all climate change debates and actions at national and international levels. So it's important to remember that women and LGBTQ plus folks are not only vulnerable to climate change, we are also effective actors and agents of change in relation to both mitigation and adaptation. Women have a strong body of knowledge and expertise that can be used in climate change mitigation. Women's responsibility in households and communities as stewards of natural and household and household resources positions them well to contribute to livelihood strategies adapted to changing environmental realities. For example, women in many indigenous communities have a strong connection to water, often leading initiatives to protect it. And here I quote, "Women have a special relationship to water in birth, ceremonies, and even cooking and cleaning." Bruce and Hartley's explain that as protectors of water, women, quote, "play an intimate role in defending this precious resource. Women's relationship with and knowledge of water has led to a higher degree of activism and community resilience related to water." To quote Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland and former UN High Commission for Human Rights and a climate change advocate and activist, "Climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. Man-made is a generic term, and it includes women. And a feminist solution definitely includes men. So what we want to do is put gender equality at the center of how we address the climate issue. We need men to recognize that many, many mistakes have been made. We're not getting out of fossil fuels quickly enough. We need to change more rapidly." So this is where the idea of gender mainstreaming comes up and becomes relevant. Gender mainstreaming is the incorporation of gender considerations at all levels of government or organizational operations, including development policy, development process, policy making, budgetary planning, and evaluation. And within that framework, financing mechanisms must be flexible enough to reflect women's priorities and needs. Technological developments related to climate change can take into account women's specific priorities, needs, and roles, and make full use of their knowledge and expertise, including Indigenous knowledge. And all post-conflict countries face serious environmental issues that could undermine the peace-building process if unaddressed, and specifically affect women who are faced by a combination of these hardships. So according to the UN, these efforts should focus on reducing women's vulnerability in tandem with men's susceptibilities, promoting gender-sensitive emergency responses, and enlisting women as in key environmental actors in natural disaster management. I always smile when I get to this part of the talk. Studies have shown that female political representation contributes to significant changes in domestic and international policies, including higher spending on health and education, more laws and expenditures relevant to female needs, and higher disbursements of foreign aid. Furthermore, female politicians have been associated with better quality of institutions and higher rates of economic growth. Based on a large sample of countries, a study found a robust positive association between female representation in a country's parliament or Congress and the stringency of its climate change policies. Let me say that again. They documented a robust positive association between female representation in a country's parliament and the stringencies of its climate change policies. The impact is significantly significant and economically meaningful. The researchers further demonstrated that through its effect on the stringency of climate change policies, female parliamentarian representation results in lower carbon dioxide emissions. A study from Yale University also found more women than men support efforts to address climate change, with limiting emissions of heat-trapping carbon dioxide as an example. Across 130 countries, women in government positions were more likely to sign on to international treaties to reduce global warming than men. So why, we might ask? So, according to Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, women have been found to be more likely to recycle, to buy organic food and eco-labeled products, and place a higher value on energy-efficient transport. Survey research in Europe shows that women express more concern about climate change than men and are more willing to make sacrifices to reduce emissions. Carol Gilligan and other social theorists around gender socialization assert that these differences can be linked to gender socialization, and that girls are socialized to be cooperative and to provide care, values that are relevant for climate change action, and are often emphasized and encouraged in women more than they are in men. Data from European states suggests that men identify with social roles performed in the society. Independent research from Mike Spitzer and others argue that increases in greenhouse gases are more often linked to activities performed by men than by women. Right, so now perhaps we have this connection between the economy, work, and industries that contribute to climate degradation. Construction, mining, engineering. Then again, since the consequences of climate change are also gender differentiated, with women more disproportionately bearing the cost of climate change, women are best positioned to see the need for climate change policies. There's been a slew of non-governmental organizations that have been formed to promote research and information sharing regarding the implications of gender, particularly women, in a climate change context. So to mention just a few, Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice is an international organization whose main objective is integrating gender justice and climate change policy at local, national, and international levels. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Global Gender Office, has been at the forefront of gender justice in climate change research and published the first gender and climate change training manual. The Teba Foundation in the Philippines has published resources examining the impacts of climate change on Indigenous women, including a report that highlights the potential threats to Indigenous women and their roles in traditional forest ecosystem and resource management. What's important to remember across the projects, as is indicated by this quote by Balalia from Peaceful Uprisings, on a bigger scale, we need to provide resources and access to those who don't have them in ways that are not tokenizing. Organizers have to stop talking of empowering people on the margins as if they didn't have their own power already. It's about getting out of the way of others to take up space while valuing the fact that power already exists in marginalized communities. It's also about understanding our own identities, where we benefit from the system and where we don't, and taking responsibility for our layers in privilege in how we move about the world. It's about established organizations being watchful of the inequalities they perpetuate, especially in terms of access to resources and to the job market within the nonprofit complex. Through all of this, we have to commit to working slowly in spite of the urgency of our crises and to holding ourselves accountable when destructive dynamics arise. So at this point in the talk, I'd like to remind us of all the heroes that have played an important role in addressing climate change. So, of course, we have to start here with the now 21-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, who began protesting outside the Swedish parliament about the need for climate change at the age of 15. She has catalyzed 1.4 million students in 112 countries to join her call to strike and protest for climate change. And Fridays for Future, with which NASCA is associated, has sparked climate action across the globe. And we are, as I said, intimately involved with that work. We can't talk about women and climate without mentioning Rachel Carson, American marine biologist. Carson documented and condemned the indiscriminate use of pesticides in her 1962 book, Silent Spring, which spanned a reversal in the US national pesticide policy and led to a nationwide movement to ban DDT. Youth activist Logan Riley works to center Indigenous rights in the climate change movement. Her nonpartisan, youth-led climate organization, Te Atu, highlights the disproportionate burden of climate change on Indigenous people. And their activism contributed to the historic inclusion of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus in direct UN negotiations on climate change and ensured that official Indigenous voices appeared in the Paris Climate Agreement. P. Brown is an organizer with the youth-led activist groups Sustain Us and Our Climate Voices. They identify as a Black, queer, femme-identifying organizer. Brown argues that, quote, if we're rooted in Black, brown, and Indigenous queer feminisms, we must acknowledge those on the margins of society already tackling the problems we face. We must invest the time and energy needed to build mutual aid and underground disaster relief networks to hold space for folks to feel safe, secure, and prepared for climate crises. The reality is we're already doing this work. We just need the resources to sustain our ability to exercise agency and autonomy. We don't need top-down solutions. We have Wangari Maathai, one of my own personal heroes, known as Mama Trees, a Kenyan environmentalist, women's rights activist. She always makes me smile. Women's rights activist and first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The Green Belt movement that Maathai founded agitated against illegal developments on public land and the eviction of poor villagers throughout Africa by large corporations. By 2004, the movement planted 40 million trees and educated on the effects that uncontrolled development has on nature. Vandana Shiva, the Indian food sovereign activist, is esteemed both as an activist and as a theorist. She promotes biodiversity in agriculture and advocates seed freedom, rejecting corporate patents on seeds. And she opposed the golden rice, a breed of rice genetically engineered. Shiva wrote and campaigned against the emergence of corporate culture and the historic erosion of communal water rights. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Shiva's ecofeminism, written in 1993, an anarchist and radical feminist sociologist, Maria Mies. So ecofeminism is founded on the connection between the exploitation of nature and the oppression of women or other marginalized groups under prevailing systems. As a contested product of this relationship, women are seen as natural and essential stewards of the environment. Ecofeminists reject what they call false solutions to climate change and work and seek support for alternatives and answers that address the climate crisis from communities themselves. False solutions, putting those in air quotes, are those responses to climate change based on savior technologies and market solutions, including, for example, the carbon credit market. The critique is, sorry, there's noise in the house. The critique is that the logic simplifies the complex reality of the climate and environmental crisis, perpetuates an unsustainable industrial model, gives false compensations, and distracts from what is really needed to address the problem. 2020 New Year's wish from Vandana Shiva illustrates ecofeminism's dramatically different orientation to climate change and environmental action. Her call is particularly poignant in these times of ruptured global markets, hate-spewing leaders, and a post-pandemic that separated us from each other. Shiva asserted, quote, "It's in the world of diversity, it's in this world of interbeings, it's in this world of cooperation that we create sustainability of living at peace with the earth." So, as I started, climate and gender go hand in hand. Addressing climate change is addressing equity. And a final quote from Wangari Maathai: "Women are the key to climate's future." And with that, I'll stop sharing and thank everyone for sticking in with me. And we can have a conversation for 10 minutes or so. Thank you, Stefan. Frank, I was glad you were in our group, since I have so many references from my own experiences from literature on Africa.
Much appreciated.
So anything, Stefan, anything we want to talk about?
Well, boy, that's very eye-opening, and it's very important to get people grounded in those understandings. I don't know if you all saw the recent this week, an article came out about NAU's Economic Policy Institute did a study of what the damage costs will be if we have catastrophic wildfire here in our mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And those costs go to we've already seen hundreds of millions of dollars in costs from flooding and fires, people's lost homes, etc. But now the projection is that we should see $2.8 billion in damages from catastrophic wildfire when those hit us. Yeah. So we are way behind the curve in finding the solutions. We need to pull out all the stops and move full speed ahead to net zero emissions.
Yeah. And I think this is why, I was thinking about Step Peggy as the slide comes up, as I bring up the slide on women recycling and gender differences around activism. And I think that's why I'm so, the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance has a project in Sedona that Peggy is spearheading, a tool lending library. And for me, the project is powerful at least two reasons. One, it's really outside the box in the ways that we think about community. So it establishes community, and it establishes a sharing community, which shifts the ways that we think about safety and relationships. And this one is has always struck me, that it's a way to get men involved in these conversations, because in Sedona, many organizations are are significantly populated by women. And so getting more men involved in ways that work for them seems really smart. And Peggy, I see you're on now. Do you want to add anything about the tool lending library and the genius of the idea? Oh, you're muted. Still muted. Well, when you get unmuted, you can join.
Unmute.
There
Okay, it's really an international movement for the circular economy. It's part of the circular economy of not consuming and not wasting, and it's all over the world. It's been in operation for decades in different places. So it's kind of about time that we do this multi-generational circulation of materials that we have, to share with people who can't afford to buy them or don't have space to store them, from people who have a lot of stuff and don't need the stuff anymore, not using it anymore. So that's the premise of it, to let people check out the tools and also learn how to use tools. I mean, we have an inventory, and some of the things in the photo inventory, I have no idea what they do. No idea what those tools do. Yet I got an email from a man today who said he's going to call me at 4 o'clock because he's interested in the aspect of it where you train people in the use of tools, certain obscure tools, and for safety reasons, you'll be able to show people a new skill too.
I believe you used the word tool whisperer yesterday, which
Yeah, tool whisper. So you kind of saddle along next to somebody and help them explore the use of the tool in a safe way and guide them towards feeling they are empowered by the tool, to do more resource saving activities where you're not discarding things right and left because you just can't fix it. You don't have the tool.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And it, gets people into conversations about climate change. Again, brings people to Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance and gets people in who or have not necessarily been part of the conversation.
Right. Well, it's kind of we have in our town and in our nation so many more resources than the rest of the world, and the rest of the world might be wanting to replicate our lifestyle, and so might be investing in more carbon intensive fuel sources in order to replicate the type of economy we have, whereas we need to roll it back and
Right.
join in with the rest of humanity in using what we have instead of spiraling on and continuing to discard usable items and just make more things.
Right, exactly.
Jill, you want to jump in? I saw you unmute a little bit ago. Thanks.
Yes, I just wanted to echo what you said about women being the most involved in organizations in Sedona, because we have often commented on that in Flagstaff, not just climate organizations, but most active organizations are run by women here in Flagstaff, and mostly elderly women.
Yeah. And so thinking about ways to get other folks involved, I think is a welcome challenge. And it also it exercises our creative juices, right? Because we're thinking outside the box about solutions.
Right, right. And that is not to say that there aren't men who are involved, because there certainly are. But
That,
the overwhelming numbers are women.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
human beings like to have challenges, and women are traditionally challenged and underserved or called upon to do more of the hands-on labor in the households, the right nitty-gritty stuff. Like you said, it was an excellent presentation. And so the writing's on the wall, you know, that there's a lot of scarcity that's happening now, and a lot of migration because of climate, and we need to be rolling up our sleeves. And I think women see that more intimately,
Yeah.
like you said.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
if I could, I want to second what Jill and Peggy were saying. If I look at who's active within NASCA, it is mostly women. And women within the activist group have stepped up to provide leadership, organization, and so forth. And that report that I mentioned earlier comes from Nancy Baca. She's a faculty member here at NAU and director of the Economic Policy Institute that released the report. And throughout the research community at Northern Arizona University, many of the climate-related and sustainability-related faculty are also women. So, yeah, it's amazing just how, to what extent what you're saying is the case here in Flagstaff.
Yeah. Yeah. This, I also like this talk because it's so, I mean, what we have found, what researchers has found is we know it all to be true, right? Just like this, right? We know that there's where we talk when we meet. And so seeing those connections, right? That women are more vulnerable, and so then women are active agents. And of course, I love that political piece about women representation. Frank asked about how men polluters can adjust and pay women. Yeah, I think that's a super good question. And I know that the last climate, and we talked about this in the climate justice presentation, that the last during the last UN climate meetings, reparations are now on the table, and mostly geared towards small island nations that have felt the effects of climate change in their existential beings, in that the islands are getting flooded and people are having to move up. But nonetheless, the notion of reparations has now entered the conversation in ways that it had not before. And so I think now there are, we're seeing the beginning of judicial processes for moving conversations about, again, remuneration forward, right? Who's responsible, who's vulnerable, and what does that mean in terms of economics? Yeah.
And
And I
it's
think,
something we
oh,
need to be
sorry.
urging, we need to be urging our government to follow through with the promises.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the US is not, despite our president's platform on climate issues, the US is not the leader that we would like to be. And so, Jill, I think you're right. The more pressure we can provide, and the more we can elect folks who are climate activists, the better. The
Yes.
better.
Right.
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 I mean, that seems so essential. Yeah. And
Correct.
go ahead, Peggy.
Well, it's just that we forget that we're not living in an authoritarian country where our president can make decisions and even policies with one. He can do some policies like that, but for the most part, we need the legislature to do it. And so there's a lot of blame gaming going on, but it's in our form of government is more like a barge, and it's not able to be a speedboat and change policies very fast. There's a lot of pushback. We just had big pushback again by the fossil fuel gas industries, where they don't want the EPA to be regulating their plants, their old plants. Well, yeah, of course. They don't want to spend the money on that.
Right.
And we have a pushback from Arizona Power this week, right? I mean, of course. And you're right. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is a huge contribution to supporting alternative energy, right? Across the country. So you're right. I mean, it's a one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one
Right.
step back.
Well, may I jump in? I'm thinking that for gender equality and also to further any of the climate measures, I believe that more women are becoming involved in politics, which will help to balance out the problems that we're talking about. Do you think that's not true?
Oh, yeah, I think that's true.
I think so. I think, when you think of reparations, I think we need to have compensations. We actually need to have the Equal Rights Amendment passed and equal wages for women. So what I was saying about oppressed, fighting harder when you're an oppressed group, that brings out the energy. And it is bringing out more people, more women to get in office. It's very disproportionate.
And there's more organizations now to support women running for office, right? So there's multiple levels of support for women to move forward.
Yes, even locally. Yes.
Yeah, locally as well, right? Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. One of the times I did this presentation, my neighbor, Ernie Strout, raised his hand and said, well, apparently the answer is elect women, which I thought was concise and right on point.
Yes. So we need to get out lots of people out to vote. That's crucial this fall. Oh, boy.
You're right. Yes.
Well, women need to get their rights over their body back. They need to be able to have self-determination over what course their life is going to take. And if they would like to be family oriented at a certain time in their life, they can make that decision. And if they want to be active in different ways, they should be able to make that decision.
Right.
Yeah. And hopefully that will get women out and get women engaged in the political process. Absolutely. Though, I mean, the pushback to regain bodily control.
Yes. For sure.
I just read that with the in vitro fertilization decision, more men are involved now. And that's what they said. Well, now that the men are involved, something will really happen.
That's a shame, but true.
Yeah.
Well, with anything in a democracy, you got to get everybody involved because it's a percentages game in terms of the vote. And yes, we definitely need more women in leadership roles across every aspect of government. We can no longer afford to have climate unaware candidates on the ticket. And occasionally we also get women who are unaware, but got to be careful in all regards. And we need to encourage all of the folks who are aware to vote.
Right.
Well, I think we need to embrace the feminine. As Frankie said, it's not necessarily what your gender is, it's what your mindset is. Is it a nurturing mindset or an extractive mindset? So there's a difference there through millennia.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Is it a living with and nurturing, or is it a controlling and commodifying? Right. Exactly.
Yes. True.
On that note, Jordan, thank you for moderating. Do you have any final comments?
I just want to say, yeah, thank you for doing this talk, Dr. Reamer. It was really interesting. We just brought the subject up in one of my classes, so hearing a more in-depth conversation about, how gender roles play, in regards to climate was very interesting, and thank you so much.
Thanks. And thanks so much for joining. And you're at NAU, right?
Yes, I'm an NAU student.
So excellent. Stefan and I are both heavily involved in different, we are both full professors, very involved at NAU. So Stefan is emeritus, nonetheless part of our community. And so we're desperate to have more folks at NAU involved. So thank you so much for all the work you do. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And reach out anytime, as we're really looking to get NAU and NASCA as closely articulated as we can, right, Stefan? And I know Stefan's doing that work in Flagstaff.
Well, absolutely. And thank you so much, Francis, for this excellent presentation. I think it's been a really good conversation, and I hope it pervades everything we do as NASCA and our entire community beyond.
Thank you. Great to see you, my
Thank
friends.
you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Enjoy the weekend. Stay grounded with this wind.
Yes, bye to all, and thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.